The Truth About Lincoln, Part 1. And I'm going to probably have to say he's about as honest Abe as any politician ever was, has been, or is to be in the future. Also, you're going to see firsthand the first time that our good old voter fraud system machines were used and don't work. So, just again, nothing new in history, nothing under the sun. Same old, same old. Nothing to see here, folks. I probably don't see this staying on YouTube very long, but so please write this website down, www.milosmathis.com. Once there, click on his writings and then click any year of his essays, and wow, this man is brilliant and deserves so much more credit than he probably gets. I don't know him personally, but I read his JFK story to you guys in the True JFK Part 1, 2, and 3, and now I'm going to read the Lincoln assassination truths, but he does everything. It's brilliant. I mean, from what's going on to up to probably last month, everything from, Oscar slap to Titanic to all the celebrity deaths to how they're all related. It's brilliant. I don't agree with everything he says, but most of them I do. So with that said, this is one of his writings. The first red flag that really put me on the right trail was the fact that John Wilkes Booth was an actor. As you probably know, much of the controversy of the Lincoln assassination has centered on Booth from the beginning. Those who have offered alternative theories have almost always started with Booth. We will see that they were not wrong to do so, but we will also see that they never went far enough. Even the most creative and outlandish theories didn't go far enough in the right direction. We have seen this over and over and over again in the other more recent manufactured events, where researchers get halfway in and then seem to get lost sometimes. It would appear on purpose. We saw this in the Kennedy assassination, where alternative researchers found some of the first major clues, but then wandered off into left field for no obvious reason. We saw it in the Tate murders, where Mae Brussels, considered the bravest of the researchers, boldly discovered the first layer of the clues, only to drift off into a fog, getting nowhere near the right answer. You will see this from Pat Shannon, who initially makes a strong charge at all these events, only to end up with theories that don't really challenge the central parts of any of them. I don't know if all these researchers divert themselves or if their jobs were to create diversion from the beginning. I really don't care. I spend my time researching the events, not researching the other researchers. You have to come to your own conclusions there. But back to Booth. The fact that Booth was an actor is a primary clue here, but I have never seen anyone lead with it. It is admitted but passed over as unimportant. But if you have read my other papers or studied recent events, you now understand how important it is. We have seen all these events featured actors from, I can't say those words. They had to because they were all manufactured events. In manufactured events, you will want actors involved because actors are trained to manufacture events. That is the job of actors. As in any other job, you hire professionals. The second red flag I found is that the assassination took place in a theater. No one ever looks closely at that. It is a red flag because this is all theater. As with Booth being an actor, I have known about Ford's Theater since I was a child. But, like the rest of you, I have never let that fact really enter my conscience. I have never seen the fact, but I have not observed it. I have memorized it like a bit of history. I might need to regurgitate for a test, but have never looked closely at it. We should have always found both facts high curious. No researcher that I know of has ever tripped over Lincoln's assassination being in a theater. The big clues are missed from the very beginning, which should tell us we have been in the presence of poor researchers from day one. From my advantage, I can tell you that it seems to be caused by the fact that the others are approaching this problem as either history or conspiracy, rather than a murder investigation. History and conspiracies tend to be very complex, while murder is usually surprisingly simple. Without exception, these other investigators allow themselves to be buried under an excess of information. They soon get lost in the bog. Since the bog was created just for that purpose, we should not be surprised to find them sinking in it. But I will show you a way to pass through without even getting your shoes dirty. The third red flag was the kind of statement, which I found over and over in my research. Very few academic historians have studied Lincoln's assassination in any depth. I think you will agree that it is astonishing. It is the indication of a successful cover-up, and a cover-up is, of course, indication that what we have been told is not true. Why would historians avoid studying or writing about the assassination? Isn't that what the historians are supposed to do? Apparently not. My research has solidified an impression I have long had, that being that historians are mainly paid to tell the accepted story, to flesh it out, and, if they really are creative, to add somewhat of a lie. I have not found that historians are especially interested in the truth, and the most famous ones seem to be the least interested. Of course, this isn't limited to historians, it applies to everyone in all fields. There is an incredible amount of top-down control, and there appears to be standing orders to avoid all truths at all times. How else to explain the current state of history, science, education, art, literature, and so on? The fourth red flag I found was the amount of current propaganda in support of this very old event. There is a lot of news misdirection on the assassination on the internet, and not just at history or encyclopedia sites. If you type in just about any question regarding the event, you get pages and pages of new lies and new fake debunking, as if this event just happened. This leads an investigator to ask several questions. Why are living people spending so much time and effort retelling the old story? Why is it so important to keep the propaganda fresh and up to date on Lincoln's assassination? Why are historians still being shushed away from the event? I will not necessarily answer those questions in this paper, but they are red flags simply because they indicate there is still something worth hiding. As I have said in previous papers, the more someone tries to convince you of A, the more seriously you should look at B. When the person is telling you things that don't make sense, double down. When the person has any connection to the government, B immediately invests heavily in B. And I always say that myself. Whenever they're telling us a story, never go with the story they're telling you. You always need to ask yourself, what are they hiding? The fifth red flag was a description of the assassination by Walt Whitman. Not many people know that Whitman gave a series of lectures in 1879 to 81, called The Death of Abraham Lincoln. Here are some excerpts I read from my memoranda written at that time and revised frequently and finally since. Through the general hum following the stage pause. With the change of position came the muffled sound of a pistol shot, which not 100 part of the audience heard at that time, and yet a moment's hush. Somehow, surely, a vague, startled thrill, and then, through the ornament-draped, starred, and striped spaceway of the president's box, a sudden figure, a man, raises himself with hands and feet, stands a moment on the railing, leaps below to the stage, a distance of perhaps 14 or 15 feet, falls out of position, catching his boot heel in the copa-sized drapery, the American flag, falls on one knee, quickly recovers himself, rises as if nothing had happened. He really sprains his ankle, but unfelt then. And so the figure, Booth, the murderer, dressed in plain black, broadcloth, bareheaded, with full, glossy, raving hair, and his eyes like some mad animal, flashing with light and resolution, yet with a certain strange calmness, holds aloft in one hand a large knife, walks along not much back from the footlights, turns fully toward the audience, his face of stupendous beauty, lit by those blasted eyes, flashing with description, perhaps insanity, launches out in a firm and steady voice the words, Secta Tamar Trinis, and then walks with neither slow nor very rapid pace diagonally across to the back of the stage and disappears. Had not all this terrible scene making the mimic one prosa, had it not all been rehearsed in blank by Booth beforehand. Very strange, as I think you will admit, although Whitman tries to put this into poetic language, as you would expect from a famous poet, this is in fact the standard story, or very close to it. Whitman misses that Booth was said to have broken his fibula in the jump, not just twisted his ankle, but that isn't what we should be looking at here anyways. What you should be asking is, 1, why would the pistol shot be muffled? This was a theater. It should have echoed. Theaters are not built to muffle sound, are they? Everyone in the audience would have heard a gunshot from the president's box. Booth should have had 10 men up him in an instant. We are told in other variations of the story that Booth fired during loud laughter from the audience after a joke on stage. But in 1879, Whitman doesn't have it that way. Despite being a writer, living through the events, making notes and revising them often, as with current manufactured events, they can't get their story straight, even 14 years after the fact. That part of the story should have been very easy to confirm, since they are supposed to have had a theater full of witnesses. And if it was the standard story in 1879, why didn't the paid programmatist Whitman III have it in his revised notes? Why would Booth jump down to the stage? Surely to avoid capture. It would have been far easier and wiser to retreat behind the curtain of the box and to flee down the back corridor, on stage with a twisted ankle or broken leg. Booth should have been a sitting duck, both for men from the audience and for men on stage or backstage. But unworried by that fact, Booth pauses to address the audience and holds up a knife. He just killed the president with a gun, not a knife. Where did this knife come from? We are expected to believe he just jumped 15 feet down with a large knife in his hand or pocket. You will say the knife was in his sheath. No. The story is Booth fought with Major Henry Rathbone, who was also in the box with Lincoln, wounding him with the knife. Two problems there. One, trying jumping down 15 feet with a large knife in your hand. I have jumped down from that height, and it is very difficult to land without injuring an ankle or a knee, even without a knife. You have to roll forward and catch yourself with your arms as well to take force off your legs. More importantly, struggling with Rathbone should have taken some time. With the shot fired, the woman screaming, and the fight with Rathbone, everyone in the theater should have been alert to the president's box. There would have been at least a dozen men at the base of the box, just waiting for Booth. He would have leaped right into their arms, not onto a deserted stage. Booth was also said to have had a stick with which he jammed the door to the presidential box, keeping anyone from coming into the box from that direction. He is said by a famous witness to have passed a note to an usher to be led into the box. So speaking to the usher, Booth was carrying a large stick, a gun, and a large knife in order to get into the presidential box with at least 3 weapons. All you need to do is pass a note to an usher. This is starting to sound like a game of Clue. The president travels with no security during the Civil War. Okay, yep. Again, remember, same thing in Dallas. You could get really close to the presidents back then, I guess. More on this below. We are told in the mainstream story that Booth was a well-known rebel sympathizer. No, we are told he was a rabid Confederate supporter, making no effort to hide it, and yet he lived in the North. He was born in Maryland and acted mostly in the Union and border states, spending a lot of time in Boston and New York and almost no time in the South. The rest of his family was blue to the core. Booth was engaged to a New Hampshire senator's daughter, and this senator was not a Democrat, much less a rebel. And of course, I will be told that wasn't so rare. But the problem is that it conflicts with another part of the story, which we see here. We are told Booth was let into the box because he was a famous actor. But even so, according to the mainstream story, he was a famous actor known to be a raving enemy of the Union. If Lincoln's Secret Service had a no-fly list, Booth would be at the top of it. So the standard story makes no sense. It contradicts itself in hundreds of places. Once on stage, Booth is now holding off every man in the theater with a knife. Not one man in the theater has a gun or a sword during the Civil War. Not one man knows how to confront a single man with a knife. Remember, Booth was known as an actor, not as a decorative soldier. In other words, he was not a fighter. I ask any soldier in the audience, are you afraid to take on an actor? My soldiers will say no actors are known to be fairies or milquetoast. Just so. Number 7, in this situation, Booth stops to make a speech. You have to be kidding me. He stops to speak Latin, quoting Brutus from Julius Caesar. You have to be kidding me. And where were Lincoln's guards? In the lobby getting milk duds? Do you really think the president traveled in public during the Civil War without guards? Come on. No one but an idiot would buy this story. This reads like a bad script, not like real history. Well, actually, our history, it does read like. Things happen like this only when they are staged. Again, that's why I said that. Here's another problem, that the presidential box at Ford's Theater, as you can see, the box is actually on stage itself, Most of the 1,700 people in the audience would be able to see right into the box. They would have seen any struggle in that box immediately. So the idea that Booth could jump down on stage before anyone in the audience realized what was happening is absurd. Another problem is that the theater has been renovated many times and that the stage is actually higher now than it was then. See how the stage is well above the first level of seating. This should look odd since the highest paying viewer would have to look up at the performance. For those in the front row, any performance near the rear of the deep stage would be particularly blocked. This was caused by the raising of the stage. But why was the stage raised? Because it lessened the height from which Booth appeared to jump. Most sources try to minimize the height to this day. Although Whitman admits it was at much at 15 feet, most sources try to sell you at 10 or 12. The truth is, the height from the railing was closer to 18 feet. Given the original stage, have you ever jumped from 18 feet onto a hard surface? You don't want to do it. You really don't want to do it with a large knife in your hand, have to give a speech, and then run from a mob out the back door. You would have to run with more than a broken fibula, most likely. You would be running with 2 broken feet. We find more confirmation of all this when we look at what happened to Ford's Theater right after the assassination. From Wikipedia, following the assassination, the United States government appropriated the theater, with Congress paying Ford $100,000 in compensation, and an order was issued forever prohibiting its use. Kind of like how they shut down a certain airport after a certain event. I should just read the next pages. I'm saying what he's saying. And how they closed, tore down, or compensated all the crime scenes after that date. Remember how they tore down that after the alleged incident? This is how it is done, and it is and always has been assigned a stage events. The best way to deter any private or real investigation is to close or destroy the crime scene immediately. Nothing more to see here, folks. Move on. In the Lincoln assassination story, they did both. First, they closed it, then bought it, then renovated it many times. This all but prevented any later analysis, which brings us to the next question no one ever asked. Why wasn't Booth fighting in the war? You will say the war was mostly over by 1865, but I mean from 1860 to 1864, why wasn't Booth fighting for the South? If he was so pro-Confederate, an even better question is this. If he was in his 20s and living in the North and able-bodied, why wasn't he drafted for the North? Do you think the actors were given exceptions? No, they weren't. I encourage you to do a search on John Wilkes Booth being drafted. I think you will be surprised at how whitewashed the subject is, both on the internet and in books. And here's a curious story from Wikipedia. Booth attended the hanging on December 2nd, 1859 of abolitionist leader John Brown, who was executed for leading a raid on the Federal Army at Harper's Ferry in present-day West Virginia. Booth had been rehearsing at the Richmond Theater when he abruptly decided to join the Richmond Greys, a volunteer military of 1,500 men traveling to Charlestown for Brown's hanging to guard against an attempt by abolitionists to rescue Brown from the gallows by force. When Brown was hanged without incident, Booth stood in uniform near the scaffold and afterwards expressed great satisfaction with Brown's fate. Although he admired the condemned man bravely and faced death stoically. That very odd for many reasons. The first reason ties into a recent paper I wrote where I showed you that Thesaurus founder Henry Steele Alt was also on hand for the hanging of John Brown as a spy for the New York Tribune. Alcott later worked for the War Department in intelligence and was on the panel investigation, the assassination of Lincoln. Well, Booth also looks like a spy or agent here, since the given story doesn't make any sense. The reason they had to come up with this story is that Booth was photographed standing near the scaffold in a gray uniform, and they needed to explain it. The problem is Booth was already a rich and famous actor by 1859, and Wikipedia admits he was making $500,000 a year by that time. Do you really think the Richmond Greys are going to allow a famous millionaire actor from the North to volunteer for a single event and then unvolunteer a few weeks later? It doesn't work that way, folks. For a start, the Greys were part of the Army, the 1st Virginia Infantry Regiment, and you don't just walk away from the Army. Go volunteer for the Army now and see if they will let you unvolunteer next month. A more logical reason of this is that Booth was acting like a Richmond Gray and failed to get caught by the real Grays in the turmoil of the event. That explains why he was able to just walk away from the part later. Mainstream sources admit Booth went right back to the theater and finished the 1859-60 season in Richmond. He then went back north for a tour of major cities. As it turns out, John Brown was also an agent, and his death was also faked. If the Richmond Grays didn't give him the uniform and set him up in that part, who did? I would say it is pretty obvious Union intelligence did, and this is just one more piece of evidence indicating Booth was working for them all along. Actors don't get draft exceptions, but actors who are also hidden agents do. As I think you can see, Booth was actually the perfect choice for this part of double agent. Actors have been used by intelligence since the beginning, since their acting skills are useful, since they travel widely, since they have many contacts, and since the charm and looks of an actor allow him or her to do many things a normal person could not do. This explains many other things, as I think you will agree, including his relationship with his family, his relationship with Hale's daughter, and his being forgiven his wild and temperate statements. Most ranking people in the North knew it was all an act, and those that didn't could be clued in later, to the extent necessary. But let us return to Whitman and the story from the theater. A moment's hush, a scream, the cry of a murder. Mrs. Lincoln leaning out of the box with ashy cheeks and lips, with involuntary cry, pointing to the retreating figure. "He has just killed the president!" And still a moment's strange and breathless suspense. And then the deluge. Then that mixture of horror, noises, uncertainty, the sound somewhere back of a horse hoofs clattering with speed. The people burst through chairs and railings and break them up. There is inner confusion and terror. Women faint. Quite feeble persons fall and are trampled on. Many cries of agony are heard. The broad stage suddenly fills to suffocation with a dense and motley crowd, like some horror carnival. The audience rushes gently upon it. At least the strong men do. The actors and actresses are all there in their play costumes and painted faces, with mortal fright showing through the rouge. The screams and calls, confused calls, redoubled, trebled. 2 or 3 manage to pass up water from the stage to the president box. Others try to clamber up. In the midst of all this, the soldiers of the president's guard, with others suddenly drawn to the scene, burst in, some 200 altogether. They storm the house. Through all the tiers, especially the upper ones, inflamed with fury, literally charging the audience with fixed batons, muskets, and pistols, shouting, clear out, you sons of a..." The Compliments was dismissed on June 2nd, 1865. In spite of leaving his post the night Lincoln was shot, Parker was still assigned to work security at the White House. They admit this at places like Wikipedia to this day. That is the story they decided to go with. No transcripts were kept. The Compliments was dismissed. The complaints. This was what they call the Glomer response, and you are seeing it 150 years after the fact. In other words, what they do is to lead with a tidal wave of lies and follow up with complete information embargo. Their overall structure of these events hasn't changed in a century and a half, as you see. This is the same sort of thing we saw at that event. However, we know this story is completely false, since it contradicts on other Wikipedia pages. Just go to pages for Alan Pinkerton, where we find this. Prior to the war, Pinkerton developed several investigator techniques still used today. Among them are shadowing, surveillance of suspects, and assuming a role, undercover work. When the Civil War began, Pinkerton served as head of the Union Intelligence Service during the first 2 years, foiling an assassination plot in Baltimore, Maryland, while guarding Abraham Lincoln on his way to Washington, D.C. His agents often worked undercover as Confederate soldiers and sympathized to gather military intelligence. Pinkerton served on several undercover missions as a Union soldier using the alias Major E.J. Allen. He was succeeded as Intelligence Service Chief by Lafayette Baker. The Intelligence Service was the preceder the U.S. Secret Service. So Lincoln was not guarded by one drunken policeman. He was guarded at all times by the intelligence services, just like the president is today. Given that, the mainstream story completely falls apart. Why would the intelligence services allow Booth into the box? Even more to the point, why would they lie about it later, trying to convince you Lincoln was not guarded? Even more to the point, we find this John Parker was very close related to Mary Todd Lincoln. See below for full genealogy analysis. You should always find it strange that Walt Whitman is repeating this ridiculous story 14 years later, and that people are paying to come hear him recite it. Anyone with any sense should have been asking them and should be asking now, who is this guy, Whitman, that is repeating such an obvious lie and doing it with such pompous flourish? You should also be asking, why hasn't anyone ever contradicted this obvious lie? Not even Mark Twain, who should have had a field day with this. It is also worth looking at the owner and manager of Ford's Theater, John T. Ford. Not only did he own many prominent theaters north and south, he was a major industrialist and railroad tycoon, being president of the Union Railroad Company and the director of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was also involved in banking. We are told that after the event, Ford and his brothers were arrested as possible conspirators, spending 39 days in jail. Yeah, right. But that is unlikely to be true. I suspect it was reported as diversion, to keep eyes off his real connections to the story. He was close to the Booths, and they spun that to make you think he might have been part of the Confederate conspiracy. But since we will see below that Booth is not who you thought, that is misdirection. Ford's ties to the Booths are important, but not for the reason we have been told. None of them were Confederate conspiracists. Ford was a Baltimore elder, and Baltimore was in the North. In fact, the whole state had been under direct federal supervision since 1861 to prevent it from seceding, as a major capitalist not dependent on slavery or tobacco. Ford was part of the supervision, not part of the resistance. In 1865, the government bought the theater from Ford for $100,000, which is about $3 million now. What we have seen already is a series of wildly flapping red flags, all of them pointing directly at a stand down, just as the military stood down on that day. Failing to launch any jets or follow any normal protocol, Lincoln's guards stood down on April 14, 1865. But we already have evidence of far more than just a stand down. We have seen ridiculous theatrical from Booth and actor. We have seen a staged event in a theater. We have seen reported events that simply could not have happened in any real life situation, when none of these people acting like people normally act. As with the actors at that event, we see people doing things that people simply do not do. In real life, Mrs. Lincoln would have screamed as soon as the first shot was fired and would have yelled, "He has been shot," immediately. Booth could not have escaped from a crowded theater, guard or no guard, but he especially could not have escaped by jumping down onto a stage, breaking his leg, giving a speech. Even in a normally, he would have immediately been mobbed, knife or no knife, but this was 1865 during the Civil War. 50 men in the audience would have shot him or run him through with a sword before he could get the sick out of his mouth. Since none of it could have happened this way, we must assume it didn't. As with all other manufactured events, what happened here happened only in a complete control environment. The prepared story was planted later, and a fair number of people were hired to tell stories to corroborate the event. The story was fake, the witnesses were fake, and the murder was fake. Yes, I'm already there. You have already hit my conclusion on page 9, but I will help you catch up. Don't worry. You will say, even if the story and witnesses were planted, the murder could have been real. You have shown us no evidence that the murder was fake. But that's not true. The fake story is itself strong indication that the murder was fake. If the story is fake, I'm pretty sure the murder's fake. We see a lot more evidence for the fake death below, but even before we get there, you should always be seriously questioning the murder. Look at it this way. The murder is the event. The murder is the central fact and only important fact. All the rest is just there to support that. We could change all the other facts and it wouldn't really matter. What I mean is, those who ran the event don't really care whether you believe Booth did it, or whether Booth was killed later, or whether there was a high-level conspiracy, including Andrew Johnson, or the Knights of the Golden Circle, or the Pope and the Queen of England. That is why they don't mind if you speculate on any of those things or all of them. In fact, they are quite happy for you to speculate on those things, because if you are speculating about translucent issues, you aren't looking closely at the murder itself. But they do care that you believe Lincoln was killed. That was the point of the entire event. Therefore, if you discover they faked the story and the witnesses and so on, you should also assume they faked the murder. If they had a real murder, there is no reason for them to fake the story and the witnesses. There is no reason to fake at all supporting evidence when you have a real murder. You only need to fake the supporting evidence when you don't have a real murder. You say it another way. The fake story could indicate hidden assassins, or it could indicate no assassins. Why has the no assassin theory never been pursued, or even put on the table? Given what we know about more recent events, we should put it on the table and see how it looks. Before we pursue any of the more complicated conspiracy theories, we should test the simplest one. Lincoln was said to have been shot at point blank range in the back of the head. We have no photos of Lincoln's body except the one above, which didn't come out until 1952. You can go to his website to see those pictures. I didn't add pictures to this one. You can't tell anything from that, obviously, but here is the death mask. A death mask of Abraham Lincoln that was made in 1865 directly from his face. Rests on display at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall. No exit wound. Where did the bullet come from? You will say they filled it up, but that death mask has many other problems. I'm a professional sculptor, among other things. I have worked in a foundry doing waxwork, chasing, and patents. I have also done live casting. Live casting is where you take a cast straight from a real face. I can tell you that isn't a life or death cast. It is faked. How do I know? Well, the strange modeling in the patina is the first clue. The patina is the coloration of the sculpture. There is no reason a death mask should be molded like that. So I assume they are trying to hide something with that patina. What they are hiding is that this mask is not a death mask. It is a copy of a life mask Lincoln had done in February 1865 by the sculptor named Clark Mills. That was just 2 months before the assassination. There was also a previous life mask made by the sculptor Leonardo Volk in 1860. Another reason I would go check out a lot of Milo's work and writings is because I think I read them all, and it probably takes me like less than 2 minutes to give you about 20 reasons why an event they are giving us currently is not the truth. So it does help you learn how to do that. So that's really a good thing to learn how to do. It almost makes you like your own little private eye. But at the same point, it's really super easy to do, and they're getting actually worse at it. But anyways, what they did with the fake death mask is combine elements of the two existing life masks. In making this combined copy, they lost a bit of detail of the real life mask, which is why this death mask didn't look right to me. Those are bronze made from the two life masks. You can see how they combined elements using the first for the beard and the overall likeness, but correcting the right ear and the hair and so on using the second. You should also ask yourself why they took the second life mask just 2 months before the assassination. That is curious in itself. That would have been after the election, but before the inauguration. Lincoln admitted he looked and felt terrible then. So we can be sure it wasn't his idea. So I will tell you why they did it. They knew they would need something they could sell as a death mask. The fake assassination was already planned, and they were creating proof of the death. That is how the mask is used to this day, as you see. With some more research, I discovered this is known by some. At a website specializing in death masks, they admit that Lincoln actually never had a death mask, but did have 2 life masks made during this lifetime. The first one was made during Lincoln's visit to Chicago in the early spring of 1860. The second life mask was created on February 11, 1865. When Lincoln compared the two, it was clear how great a toll the Civil War had taken on his health. Reportedly, one friend who saw him a week after the last mask was made noted that he looked bad and felt badly. To another friend, Lincoln confided, "I am very unwell." Ironically, in 2007, a study was done of Lincoln's face, life mask, and a medical record, and it was concluded that he suffered from a disease called multiple sclerosis neurona syndrome, a form of cancer. It was also determined that he had not been assassinated. Lincoln would have succumbed to this disease rather quickly anyways, within the year. Wow. So let that be your next clue. That fact has never been tied to the alleged assassination, has it? It has just been left as a floater. But that fact by itself explains why they needed to fake his assassination. That clue only allowed on the scene about 6 years ago, which may explain why I am the first to put the various pieces together. I will pause to remind you that Whitman and many others confirmed that Lincoln looked badly. In the above lecture, he said, "I saw Abraham Lincoln often the 4 years following that date. He changed rapidly and much during his presidency. Since Lincoln was only in his mid-50s, this should be very surprisingly. Remember, Lincoln was basically a one-term president. He served only 1 month of his second term. So this change all occurred over the span of just 4 years. Except perhaps for some graying and possible weight gain, most healthy people don't change rapidly and much in their mid-50s. And yet anyone can see by studying the photos above and comparing it to the photos from just 2 years earlier that Lincoln had aged dramatically between age 54 and 56. Regarding the diagnosis of cancer, Dr. John Sotos of the University of North Carolina School of Medicine did not come to this conclusion ideally. He drew his conclusion of men to be from more than 300 sources, including 5,900 physical and mental observations about Lincoln and his family members. Each observation is fully referenced and organized into the form of a modern medical record. A reader who has followed me up to this point will naturally ask, why would they wish to fake Lincoln's death? If they didn't want him as president, why not just convince him not to run? If they wanted Andrew Johnson to be president, why not just run Johnson instead of Lincoln? Because they knew Lincoln could win and Johnson couldn't. They wanted Johnson as president, but knew he couldn't win on his own. Johnson was a terrible speaker and wasn't much known outside of Tennessee. The only way to get Johnson into the White House was via Lincoln, and they knew that. So they had to run Lincoln in 1864 despite the fact that everyone inside knew he was dying. We actually have confirmation of that straight from the mainstream source. When Grant's 1864 spring campaign turned into a bloody stalemate in Union Castle Mountain, the lack of military success wore heavily on the president's re-election, and many Republicans across the country feared that Lincoln would be defeated. Sharing this fear, Lincoln wrote and signed a pledge that if he should lose the election, he would still defeat the Confederacy before turning over the White House. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, and he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Lincoln did not show the pledge to his cabinet, but asked them to sign the sealed envelope. Historians have always found that to be very curious, even beyond the signing of a sealed envelope. It looks very much like an early contentious government plan, like they have now for emergencies. It is basically a pledge to ignore the Constitution and all laws. And who is Lincoln supposed to be making this pledge to? Himself. Since it was sealed, it was not a pledge to the people or to the Congress. We must assume it was a pledge to his overseers, the plutocrats who were actually running the country. Notice that Lincoln says he is pledging to cooperate with the president-elect, when he is pledging to do just the opposite. A sitting president doesn't have to pledge to cooperate with the president-elect, since he is expected and required to do that anyways. A pledge in this case would be meaningless. Remember, if the Democratic McClellan had been elected instead of Lincoln in 1864, it would have indicated the voters no longer supported the war. The incoming Democrat and Congress would have had mandate from the people to end the war, including making a settlement with the Confederacy. The president would no longer have to support to defeat the Confederacy. But Lincoln is pledging to ignore all that, ignore the will of the voters, and continue the war against the mandate of the incoming president-elect. That is not cooperation, that is opposition. It is also completely illegal, which is why the envelope was sealed. Lincoln even admitted that in his quote above, he says, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Of course, that just means that in being elected, the Democrat will have no reason to save the Union. If the voters had wished to save the Union, they would have voted for Lincoln, right? Obviously. Lincoln is pledging to ignore the will of the voters, ignore the Constitution, and continue persuading the war up to the inauguration in March of 1865, and probably after. Given the wording of this pledge, we would not expect Lincoln to have transferred the presidency in March. If he was willing and capable of ignoring the law, the people, and the Constitution during the intermeet, why would he not continue to ignore them afterwards? As it turns out, the pledge was moot, since Lincoln and Johnson won the election of 1864. But that election was very strange, just like the rest of this. They avoided defeat even in Johnson's home state of Tennessee, only by cheating. Johnson had been the governor of Tennessee since 1853, and congressman for that state before that back to 1843. But Lincoln and Johnson, realizing they were going to lose Tennessee, decided to require an oath from Tennessee voters that they did not support making a settlement with the Confederacy. This officially disfranchised any and all McLaren's votes. Congress saw this as flagrant unconstitutional. They threw out the votes from Tennessee. We are told that Lincoln and Johnson nevertheless won the national election by a wide margin, but we find similar, if less obvious, cheating in every other state. There is a strong evidence that the election of 1864, like every other close election, was stolen.
Even the mainstream admits this. For example, Lincoln won the entire state of New York by only about 6,500 votes, or less than 1%. That alone would have swung 66 electoral votes. Pennsylvania was decided by about 19,000 votes, and that would have swung another 52 votes. Remember Lincoln's pledge? Even the bosses were afraid of losing the 1864 election, and they were making extraordinary plans in case they didn't. They weren't sure they could deliver the votes. As it turns out, they found a way to do it without even making it look close. What? One way they did it, that was by allowing Confederate or border states to vote if they were sure to go to Lincoln, but now not allowing any Confederate states to vote if they were likely to go to McLaren. Kind of sounds like some other vote we went through. Voters in many other states than Tennessee were disfranchised by local voting laws that either required them to support the Union or otherwise guarantee their votes. Ask yourself why all the brown states there weren't allowed to vote. It was because they weren't agreed beforehand to vote for Lincoln. So although Wikipedia admits that several states were won by less than 5%, the margin of stealing was actually well beyond that, given the tricks of the time. Even in Indiana and Lincoln's home state of Illinois were close. Lincoln won Illinois by only 30,000 votes. Given that Illinois has had one of the most corrupt political machines since the beginning, you can be sure they were fighting a way to keep McLean votes from the polls. But could they push the vote by more than 8% points? Of course. They pushed the votes more than that in Tennessee and Louisiana, which is why Congress refused to recognize the results there. You will say, even if that is true, what does it have to do with Lincoln being mortally ill? They are linked because they are all indications that extraordinary things were going on at the time, all having to do with consents of the preferred government. We see that those running the country behind the scenes had to win the election of 1864 in order to finish off the war they had started. The only way they could hope to do that was with Lincoln. No Union candidate but Lincoln could win, even with the amount of cheating they planned to do. Neither Johnson nor any other Union candidate could have won, even with all the cheating in the world. And it would have been a disaster for those running the country if the Democrat McClellan had won. Therefore, Lincoln had to be convinced to run, even though he was too sick to serve another term. He probably said something like, "Look, friends, I would love to obligate you, but there is no way I can handle the responsibility of president for another term. It just isn't possible. I need to retire and either nurse myself back to health or die in comfort." I think I have at least earned that privilege. His friends, realizing that they had to run Lincoln or perish, then came up with a brilliant plan. "See here, Abe," they replied, "we understand your point, but we only need you for the election. We don't need you for the rest of the term. Just give your inaugural address and then we will let you go." Lincoln then looked at them mystified and said, "How are you going to do that?" "We'll fake your death. Just tell everyone you died. We will then secretly move you back to Illinois or wherever you want to go, and it will all be over. You just have to agree to stay on the farm and not show yourself in public." "I guess we can do that." "Of course we can. It has been done before. We fake deaths all the time. It isn't nearly as hard as you think. We control the press and the police and can easily quash any rumors." And yes, they can, even to today. Within a week of the inauguration address, Lincoln had probably already gone back to his farm, but they didn't tell him how they planned to fake it. My guess is he thought they were just put a death notice in the paper and fake a funeral. Instead, they decided to use the event to create a lot of emotions and further the Union cause. They drew up a script that made Lincoln into a hero and a martyr, and that scapegoat some Confederate sympathies. These guys were masters of propaganda even then, and they knew how to turn a bad situation into a great one. It was brilliant, since Lincoln's assassination is what cemented the Union cause finally an end that was still somewhat in doubt. All the emotions created acted to bring the country, or at least the North, back together. After the assassination, there was a period of unity, and those behind the new president used that unity to promote the final points of the war, including the various of the Reconstruction. The next question I foresee is this one. Why couldn't Lincoln just retire after the inauguration in 1865? That would have achieved the same thing, right? No. The vice president becomes president if the president dies or resigns. That is true. But according to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the Constitution, there is confusion on this point. This is why the amendment, whatever number that is, was later added to the Constitution. According to the wording of Article 1, if a president declares an inability to serve based on ill health, the vice president only becomes acting president until the disability be removed or the president shall be elected. elected. In other words, it is likely that the clause would have been read that Congress should wait until Lincoln got better or died. But it was probably feared that if Lincoln retired due to ill health, one of the two things might happen that no one wished to happen. Either the government would be considerably weakened at it time it could ill afford to be weakened due to the lack of authority of an acting president, or the Congress, seeing this predicament as a sign of weakness in the executive, might either impeach both president and acting president as ex officio appointing a new president under the terms of Clause 6, or call for a special election. None of these possibilities could be countenanced in 1865. In late 1864, the future of the war was still very much in doubt, and so they could not rest that Lincoln might retire due to illness in 1864. They had to convince him to run, since it was their only chance of winning the election, but they could not let them serve. As you can see, there is only one solution to the problem: fake his death. You will say there are two solutions: fake his death or kill him. But since it's much easier to fake his death and much less risky, there is no reason to kill him, and many strong reasons not to. If you can achieve the same thing with a faked event that you can achieve with the real event, you will go with the fake event every time. That is precisely why we have seen so many faked events in recent history. This is especially true with a murder. They do it all the time. Actors do it. Everyone does it. But why I was kind of stumbling while I was reading, sorry, I was thinking, I wonder if maybe a certain sniffy president's going to supposedly get sick, and what they're planning on doing there, if that means Orange Man can come back. Just a thought, but moving on. If they had actually assassinated Lincoln, they would have risked being caught. The penalty would have been extreme, but it has always been very hard to prosecute someone for a fake murder. There were probably no laws on the books at that time that would have applied, and the prosecution, even if it occurred, was unlikely to be for capital crime. The chosen solution turned out to be brilliant, since Andrew Johnson's authority was actually increased by the event rather than decreased. If Lincoln had retired due to ill health and Johnson had been elevated to acting president, his authority would have suffered from the confusion. But due to the apparent assassination of Lincoln, Johnson benefited from all the emotions created by the event. We see this in the history of the times, where Johnson's popularity was very high at first but faded quickly. Very few suspected Johnson or anyone else of foul play, with the majority rallying behind their new president in a time of crisis. This is exactly what was planned, and for a short time it worked marvelously. It worked long enough to finish off the war, preventing a settlement or concession to the South, which was job one. You will say, but if that is true, why not admit it now? Why is the government perpetually lying? Wouldn't people be relieved by the truth? Isn't a fake death better than a real assassination at this distance in time? You would think so, but you can see that would be very hard for the government to admit a lie of this magnitude, and they will never admit anything, because then it would just make you start looking at other things, and that's not what they want you to do. They would have to admit that all the history books were fake for 150 years, and this would incriminate all those who faked the history, including Walt Whitman and many thousands of other famous people. It would also put into question all other events of history, which are also all lies. The lie is so big, so old, and so far-ranging that those in power feel they have no choice but to continue it. It is thought that the entire myth of the United States relies on it. I would suggest that the myth of the U.S. is already dead. Everyone knows recent history is a lie, either consciously or subconsciously, and that is why we are in the state we are in. The only way to rebuild confidence in government and in life in general is to come clean and start over. These lies have fed on one another, growing and multiplying, and they have ended up causing the collapse of the entire society through a general corporation and rot. So although those in charge think they have no choice and that they are protecting society from collapsing by continuing to lie, just the opposite is true. It is the lies that are causing the collapse, and the only hope is to quit the lies and embrace the truth. We are told that any lie is preferably the truth, but that itself is a lie, told to protect the guilty. Any truth is preferable to a lie. As further evidence the whole event was faked, we can look at another famous photograph. That is Lewis Powell, and the photo is tagged. Again, I didn't put any of the photography in these stories, but you can go to his website and look up this story and find the pictures. Another thing is, I really could never see our government ever coming clean about anything because they've gotten away with it for so long, and that's basically how they control the people, is through the fear of the lie. So I can't see them changing that. Powell and wrist irons aboard the Monitor USS Sagres, photographed by Alexander Gardner, 1865. Powell is said to be the one who was assigned the killing of Secretary of State Sewell, stimulously with Booth's killing of Lincoln. That photo looks staged as well. Both he and the picture are entirely too pretty. Here are some other pictures of Powell. So Powell just happened to be even more handsome than the universal acclaimed charmer John Wilkes Booth. What are the odds of that? Actually, in these manufactured events, it is par for the course. They are hiring actors, and of course, actors are known for their looks. Here are two pictures of Booth. Please note the hand position in the last, which tells us not only who Booth really was, but what to think of his event. Booth was said to have been tallish for the time, around 5'8". Average was around 5'6", but Powell was much taller. You can see that he was a giant for that time. We are told 6'2". You can also see that they told him, Lewis, look mean for this one. The last pictures were way too sexy. And what's in God's name is he wearing there? Are we supposed to believe that is regulation prison attire? It looks more like an artist's smock. He should have paint brushes in his hands. So who was Powell? Well, for starters, he was an admitted spy. Mainstream sources tell us he was in the Confederate Secret Service, but his story indicates to me another double agent, just like Booth. He was clearly working for the Union in this faked assassination, working mainly as another actor, which would make him Union Secret Service, not Confederate. We have plenty of evidence for this since he traveled across battle lines many times, including an escape from a POW camp in Baltimore to rejoin the Virginia Cavalry. We are told he managed this escape with the help of a nurse, but the whole story is fishy. It is much more likely that his trips north were for debriefing or holidays, and that his return to the South was a return to his spying for the North. I would suggest to you that Powell didn't escape from the POW camp in Baltimore. He was recruited for intelligence there. It wasn't with the help of just a nurse that he escaped. He was allowed to escape by higher-ups. The story that he later became Confederate intelligence is just a cover-up. My interpretation fits the facts far better than any mainstream story. As more evidence for that, we are told that after some time in Virginia, he returned to Baltimore to revisit the nurse, Maggie Branson, but again, it is much more likely Branson also worked in intelligence for the Union, and that she was a contract, not a lover. Why do I think that? Well, we are told that while in the North this time, he was arrested as a spy and required to sign an oath of allegiance, which he signed as Lewis Payne. None of that makes any sense. They don't arrest spies, have them sign oaths of allegiance, and then just release them. Normally they execute or jail them. If he was simply released, we must assume it was because he was a double agent, working for the North while appearing to work for the South. This applies to John Stewart as well, a contact of Powell, also said to be a conspirator against Lincoln and a Confederate spy. However, anyone who looks closely can see he was another member of the Union intelligence. Why do I think that? Here's another curious story from the mainstream. Not wanting to take part in the fake trials after the fake assassination, Sherrault left the country and ended up being a papal Zural. A Zural is a guard for the Pope. Remember my joke above about the Pope being involved? We won't go there. But this does allow some other interesting analysts. I say I won't go there because although the Vatican undoubtedly did have ties to some of the wealthy people in the U.S. pulling the strings of the war, the Pope cannot have had anything to do with the assassination of Lincoln. Conspiracy theorists try to pull all sorts of players into their theories, as you know, but if Lincoln wasn't assassinated, all these theories fall apart. I am not saying dark hands aren't pulling the strings of presidents, but in this case, the answer is much simpler. There was no dark conspiracist to assassinate Lincoln, since he wasn't assassinated. If you want to pursue these dark theories, you have to theorize about the great control of the Civil War, not about Lincoln's assassination. That is a picture of Sherrault as Zural in 1866. He is supposed to be on the run for being involved in the biggest U.S. conspiracy of all time, but he allows himself to be professionally photographed. This is all just a continuance of the joke. It is also more proof Sherrault was a Union intelligence, since only an intelligence officer would be so bold. He knew he was protected. We see proof of that when an old friend, Henry Brant de Santa Maria, recognized Stewart and notified papal officers and Rufus King, U.S. minister in Rome. On November 7, 1866, John Stewart was arrested and sent to Vilford prison. He escaped and lived with the guardians who gave him safe passage. Agents escape from prison, but almost no one else does. We see it again when he was finally caught and brought back to the U.S. for trial. Unfortunately, the statute of limitation had just run out. So convenient, right? Stewart ended up marrying a cousin of Francis Scott Key, living in Baltimore, the North, and having 7 children. He was clearly protected from the beginning by the winner in the war, not the loser. As more proof of that, you should also take a close look at the Savon connection. The main protector of the Pope at this time was not the Savonese. They were only guards. The protector of the Pope was the army of France. France, although said to be neutral in our Civil War, was actually aligned with the North. France never recognized the Confederate States and at times helped in their blockade. And although Garibaldi was not an ally of the Vatican, the Garibaldians were nonetheless allies of the Union. Garibaldi was beholden to the North for financial support during his campaign, which is why the Garibaldians shuttled Surratt. So both the Zavi connection and the Garibaldi connection links Surratt to the north, not to the south. We have been fed a lot of disinformation on this point, with the main street most often telling us Surratt's connection to the Pope indicate his Confederate ties, but that simply is an inversion of the truth, as you see. I will be told that Surratt's mother Mary was the first woman hanged by the U.S. and that she died along with Powell, Harold, and Asalto, but that event was also faked. What indications do we have of that? To start with, they needed a photo of conspiracist George Alcerto, so they just faked one. That's supposed to be by Alexander Gardner again. Problem is, it is in color. They didn't have color film back then. You will say it was colorized later, but why colorize his but not Powell's? Plus, it was supposedly taken at the same time Gardner took the picture of Powell above. On the prison ship Sagos. See how they have tried to make the background look similar, but if you have ever done photography, ask yourself why the high professional photographer Gardner would change the f-stop on his camera between prisoners, blurring out the background here while having it in sharp focus with Powell. As a photographer who has used the old cameras, I will tell you he didn't. This is fake. They blurred the background for a reason, so that you couldn't compare it directly to the one behind Powell, showing up the fake. Don't believe me? Here's another one, supposed to be from the same shoot. That's really incredible. They have kept the original fake where it is being pasted up. They should have destroyed that in progress. Fake, but they didn't. You can see how they pasted him in there, and then later they would have someone paint in the white areas to blend them in. Wow. Another way we know this was all faked is the Harold, Austrant, and Mary Stuart were not military. So why were they tried in a military court? That is highly illegal. Civilians must be tried in a civil court according to the Constitution and all rules of the Army. The Supreme Court ruled on this a year later, but that was just cover. They didn't need to rule on it since the laws already existed and were crystal clear. They were tried to military court to hide and manage the fraud. Another way we know this is that David Harold's father was chief clerk at the Naval Storehouse at the Washington Naval Yard for over 20 years. The family lived just up the street. Well, the Washington Naval Yard and the Washington Arsenal are the same thing. The conspirators were allegedly hanged there, remember? So do you think it is just a coincidence that Harold's father ran the place, which brings us to this quote. Alexander Gardner, who had photographed the body of Booth, had taken portraits of several of the male conspirators while they were imprisoned aboard naval ships. Photographed for the execution for the government. Since there was no body of Booth, Gardner is immediately suspect. He is also the one who took the sexy photo of Powell above, so again, he is a suspect. In addition, attendance at this execution was severely limited, and almost all those in the audience were military personnel. Fewer than 200 tickets were printed, and we aren't told they were all given out or sold. This is important because military personnel can be ordered to keep quiet. They only see what they are told to see. Before we move on, let us study that last quote. Gardner is supposed to have photographed the body of Booth. Where are those photos? They don't exist. Search for them on the internet. If a photo of the dead Booth existed, it would be all over the internet, isn't it? We can see why the photo has to be destroyed. If we study the history of the identification of Booth's body, Charles Dawson, the hotel clerk, said he knew Booth from the initial tattoos on his wrist, but he named the wrong wrist. The captain's clerk on the Montour, the ship where Booth's body was first taken, said he knew Booth had recognized the body from general appearance. Likewise, the Montreal acting master, William Crownshield, there is no good evidence that either of these had ever met Booth. Dr. John Frederick May, who had been removed a tumor from Booth's neck, was summoned. His first comment was, "There is no resemble in that core to Booth, nor can I believe it to be him." Dr. May later said the scars on the neck were similar to Booth's. No stage acquaintance, personal friends, relation, or co-conspirators were questioned, although they were readily available. Booth was the most wanted man on earth. The natural course would be to take the body to Washington, where as many people as possible could see it. Pictures taken and documentation by impressible sources. The Army did the exact opposite. Instead of taking the remains to a hospital, they were placed on a ship where the number of people allowed to view the body was controlled by the Army. Sounds like a couple other events in history later on. Dr. May was the only witness to identify the body who had actually known Booth. This identification was obviously made under duress. His first statement was, "There is no resemblance to that corpse to Booth, nor can I believe it to be him." Luther Baker, cousin of Lafayette Baker of the War Department and one of those who had captured Booth, then had a private conversation with May, who then said that the scar was similar to Booth's. Washington was under martial law at that time and habeas corpus, and had been suspended. Therefore, Baker had the power to put Dr. May in jail without being charged and could keep him there indefinitely. The body was interred almost immediately after the inquest in the Army's arsenal, where the Army had total control of the site. What was the hurry? Of course, get rid of the evidence as quick as possible, the usual. This ends part one. Something I do find kind of neat, and I would do, is go definitely look at his pictures, because you'll notice in one, John Wilkes has his hand inside his coat, and anybody who understands the Illuminati and all that would understand that. But it's weird when you go online, his hand is now outside of the coat, so just shows you what they're able to do. But he does have the original photo where his hand is halfway into his jacket. That's another thing. Learn the different symbols of things they do, and you'll see how they're all related there too. But this ends part one. Thanks.